before we jump into this podcast, let's just have a first word from our sponsors, NordVPN, the fastest VPN in the world and an absolute essential traveling companion. You can use NordVPN on 10 devices with just one account, easily switching your virtual location to access apps and websites in other countries. But if you're out of the country, make sure that you've got NordVPN to be able to use your subscriptions and watch the live sport that you might miss. If you're at home, use it to see if you can save money with products that might be cheaper in another region. Go to nordvpn.com/Manchester to get 4 extra months on the 2-year plan. The link is also in the podcast description. Hello and welcome to the Manchester is Red podcast. My name is Steven Railston. We're recording this episode on a Friday morning. It's a very snowy Friday morning in Manchester. It was -5 when I woke up this morning. So I hope Samuel Luckhurst, who was with me on this podcast, is nice and warm. Samuel, how are you feeling?
I'm feeling fine, feeling well.
Feeling nice and warm?
Standard question. Thanks to the heating, yes. Yeah. I hope everyone else is as well.
Well, I think you have to win the lottery these days to have the heating on for a full day. So you might have to ration it throughout the Friday afternoon. But after the press conference later, Ruben Amorim will be addressing journalists ahead of United's game against Arsenal in the third round of the FA Cup on Sunday, of course. But we'll start off with some transfer housekeeping in the first section, and then we'll look ahead to that game in the second part. So we should probably start with Kobbie Mainoo, Samuel, because that dominated headlines earlier in the week. That story, there is a situation brewing. His future is suddenly a bit uncertain. He signed a new contract in 2023, and the club opened talks with him last year over a new deal. But talks have stalled, and there's currently a bit of a stalemate as we understand it. I was told Mainoo wants to stay at his boyhood club, but he does want to have his kind of role in the squad reflected in his wages. What is your take on the situation over the last few days? Because it's kind of just came out of nowhere, this story, and it's been kind of dominating headlines, hasn't it, during this week?
It has. I was off on Tuesday, and it eventually ended up having to file something on that because someone told me something that was newsworthy in relation to it, and that was that he's not happy with the initial offer that United have put forward to him. And obviously it was the story that broke in the day by Chris Wheeler about Chelsea being interested in Mainoo, which certainly the way Chelsea have gone about their business in recent years is not a huge surprise. But Kobbie Mainoo is effectively tied to United until 2028. And it does feel like, looking at it from the outside, that it's a bit of a negotiation tactic by his agent, possibly David Lockwood. Not saying that for absolute certainty. But, of course, this is a player who, as you said, the last time he signed a contract, he was 17. So he's going to be on, compared to other players in that squad and players who are not performing as well as he has over the past 12 or 13 months, they're going to be on much higher wages than him. So that's why time is of the essence. And of course, as far as United are concerned, any academy sale now is seen as fair game. That was pretty much outlined by Dan Ashworth back in September. Of course, Mainoo is a player that United would prefer to keep, quite logically, but there has been a shift in the stance from the summer where there were 4 players that were deemed not for sale. That's no longer the case. United pretty much, if an acceptable offer comes in for a player, then they're inclined to accept that offer, partly because of the PSR rules and their struggles to comply with them and FFP, where they've been sailing far too close to the wind. And that's why they sold a lot of academy players in the summer. And I completely agree with all of those academy sales. I don't think there's a single one that, even with Alvaro Fernandez, it was clear that he wasn't going to get a kick under Erik ten Hag, so you might as well get the money for him. I don't agree with the way Ten Hag managed him at all, but once it was clear that Ten Hag was probably going to keep his job, it made sense to get money for him. And of course, they've got a buyback option on Fernandez as well. But Willie Camboala, Scott McTominay, Mason Greenwood, Will Fish, Hannibal Mejbri, and Fernandez, all of those sales were completely logical, understandable, and sensible. and United don't have quite as many sellable academy assets in that squad now. And the two who stand out, of course, are Garnacho and Mainoo, two players that they would not have entertained selling whatsoever in the summer, but they've had pretty difficult times individually since then for different reasons. It's not nothing. It's not like they've gone past the point of no return at United, but Garnacho, there were question marks there as to his suitability under Amrim, and certainly until the Anfield game, he had not, as far as his performances were concerned, he had not reacted well to his to when he was dropped for the Manchester derby in mid-December. With Mainoo, I would argue he is a far more important player to United purely because their midfield is so light. They've got two good midfielders who you would want to start pretty much in every game in Mainoo and Ugarte, and especially given how well Ugarte has done over the past 2 months. Beyond them, you've got two players who one will probably be released this year, Christian Eriksen. The other one, Casemiro, really has to be sold this year, whether it's this month or the summer. He's got to go one way or the other. And then you've got Toby Collier, who's not played since the League Cup tie against Barnsley when he was put at left back and struggled manfully because he's not a left back. So I would argue that Mainoo is more important than Garnacho. When you look at Garnacho's personality, and I think we've always sensed that there's a good chance that he will end up back in Spain at one of the three big clubs there. He may go back to Atletico Madrid at some point. You never know. Real Madrid, I think, is a bit trickier because they've got a couple of decent left-sided wingers there in Vinicius Junior and Kylian Mbappe. But where United are playing this system now, when clearly and quite rightly, Amrim does not see Garnacho as a winger in that midfield four because it just doesn't suit him and it doesn't suit the team. He's only got one option there, and that's to develop as a playmaker, and not just the playmaker in the team, but as one of two playmakers. And there's an awful lot of adjustment that will require for someone who has been developed as a winger at Atletico Madrid's academy and United's academy, and then he joined a team famed for its wingers in United, and all of a sudden he's in a position where they're not playing with conventional wingers. That may be different next season once they've been able to have a summer transfer window. But Amrim has said that he wants to play fullbacks in those roles. So will he be signing fullbacks for those roles on the flanks or wing backs? I don't know. But clearly, attacking wingers are not quite the right balance for it. And we've discussed that ad nauseum already. So I think it's sensible for United to keep an open mind about players. And look, they're 13th in the Premier League. They've lost 10 of their 30 games this season. They're out of the League Cup. This is clearly, despite the very good performance at Anfield, this is the worst United team that many people have seen since the side that was relegated in 1974. So there should be no untouchables. I mean, I forgot to add on Monday, I made a dreadful mistake last week when Ty flipped the question. It's not a case of who would you sell as more of who would you keep. And somehow I forgot to mention Ahmad in the 3 or 4 players I mentioned. I think I said Ugarte, Yoro, Mainoo, and I left it at that. I made a massive error there somehow forgetting Ahmad, and obviously he's got his contract anyway. But there are not many players in that squad that I would be fussed about leaving if I was a United fan. Mainoo is one I would be fussed about if he left because I've never agreed with this PSR rule in terms of it incentivizing academy sales. I think that's a big flaw. United are still quite non-committal on that. Ten Hag obviously expressed his dismay at it, and because he wanted to keep Scott McTominay. And I think that certainly that rule does need adjusting. There are some clubs who have always, used the academy as a cash cow more than as a way to, fuel and further the first team. But United have not been like that. They should have used it as a cash cow more often, but they have always produced very good players for the first team through the academy. And it would be a pity if the era of the one club player was to end because of essentially a financial fair play rule that's been introduced by the Premier League. And you've seen some very good players leave some clubs where they would have been assets this season. I suspect Elliot Anderson would have been an asset for Newcastle, not necessarily a starter, but he would have certainly done a very good job for them and made the squad stronger. The chap the lad they sold to Brighton, is it
Yeah,
Minter,
Minter.
the winger,
Yeah.
looks a good player as well. But they got big money for those players, and I think there's a player who's about to leave Aston Villa who they re-signed in the summer. Is it Jaden Filler? Oh, I can't remember how you pronounce
Yeah,
his
for
surname.
25 million to Ipswich Town.
For £25 million to Ipswich Town, and we know why they're doing that. It's because he's going to represent pure profit, even though they had to re-sign him from Hull in the summer. It's because he came through their academy. So it really does need a pretty detailed conversation at one of the Premier League meetings, because I think that has got to change somewhere or another. Because otherwise, clubs, certainly in the case of United, there's a danger that the club will lose their identity. And United, of course, have got this extraordinary record of God knows how many games it is, stretching back to the 1930s, of an academy player being in a match day squad. And this PSR rule does jeopardise that. I don't think I'll live to see the day where there's not an academy player in a Manchester United matchday squad, and I certainly hope that's never the case. But certainly the threat of it has grown with PSR's introduction, which I agree with in principle. I think it's a good measure to bring in to stop mismanagement of clubs and reckless owners. But the academy issue it's definitely a flaw in it.
The likes of Chelsea and Manchester City have used it to their advantage, haven't they? Where they've got
Yeah.
incredibly well-run clubs and they've been selling these academy players for big money. And as you said, used them as a cash cow. But unfortunately, United, although they produce a lot of players for the Football League, they haven't really got the transfer fees that reflect that. And really, you want those players to be going to Premier League clubs because that's where the bigger transfer fees are. You think of Manchester City selling Bazanu and I can't remember who the lad on the wing was called, but they got decent money for both of them to Southampton. So United have to
Oh,
kind of copy that
Bazunu, the
model.
keeper. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I can't remember who the winger was called. Anyways, he used to remind us of Sane when I watched them in City's academy. But the sold two players to Southampton. Anyways, United need to copy that model going forward. Briefly, just going back to Mainoo, I've had a few fans ask us, well, why is this a priority? He's got a contract until 2027, and as you've said, essentially 28 because there's an option of an
Money.
additional year. Yeah, exactly. But he's been earning the same amount of money for almost 2 years. It'll be 2 years next month that he's been on the same contract. The performance-related bonuses have been triggered, so he is earning more than his initial terms. But if he's looking around in that dressing room and thinking, well, I'm starting alongside you and I'm playing a prominent role, why am I not being paid the same? And that's fair enough. Whether or not that means 200k, I don't think so. But there's probably going to have to be a
No, I
compromise on
agree with
both
that.
sides, isn't there? Yeah. Moving forward then to Ahmad, he signed a new contract until 2030. That was officially announced yesterday, which was great to see. He's developed a knack of scoring against United's rivals, hasn't he, Samuel? He scored some brilliant goals. You think back to the game against Liverpool at Old Trafford in the FA Cup. That was a fantastic day. And then this season as well, he scored against City and Liverpool again. Richly deserved, and I actually think his future probably lies at right wing back. Samuel,
You can
He's
say Newcastle as well, Stephen. I mean, Newcastle are United's rivals these days. They are, they're well in their
I'm not sure
slipstream.
about yeah.
They're
I'm not
ahead
sure.
of them. Come on, come on. You got to
I'll not be drawn into
maximize
it.
it while you still can.
I'll not be drawn into it. But look, he's had a great season, and like I say, I think his future is right wing back. He's played more prominent, hasn't he, in the last 6 weeks or so? But when you look at that system, he played really well in that position when he was first moved there.
The playmaker role or on the
The
wing.
right wing back role, yeah. I mean, he can obviously play both, and his versatility is a huge asset. But I quite like him at right wing back.
Yeah, and somewhat ironically, I don't think he's actually started there since the Forest game, which obviously United lost, but it was a game where you looked at the team that day and you thought, this is possibly. I mean, we're still wondering what is the best United 11 because they've not got the form to back it up. This is a team that hasn't won 2 successive league games all season, but that day you certainly looked at it and thought this is probably the best available players in the positions available that Ruben Amorim could pick. And since then, Ahmad has moved forward to the playmaker role, but he's finally playing under a manager who trusts him. He didn't have that under Ten Hag. he wasn't really Ole Gunnar Solskjaer signing. I'm not criticising Solskjaer for that whatsoever. He was very raw when he arrived, and the immediate plan was to send him out on loan in his first full season at the club and try and develop him. And obviously, it didn't quite go according to plan with having an injury in the first half of the season, going to Rangers the second half of the season. He had to wait another season really to have that fulfilling loan where he showcased his class really. Ten Hag had a blind spot there. Ten Hag had a few blind spots. Left back was one. Ahmad was another one. He didn't even want to play him during the FA Cup semi-final against Coventry. I know for a fact he was pretty much railroaded into that because of Marcus Rashford's injury. He effectively looked at Ahmad and bracketed him with the other rookies on the bench: Habib Ogunai, Harry Amas, Ethan Wheatley, Louis Jackson, Amari Forson, who by that point failed his audition as a starter against Fulham. And it was only after the seasonal nadir against Crystal Palace, where they lost 4-0, that Ten Hag changed it up a little bit, and he brought some players in out from the cold. Sofian Amrabat started in the next game against Arsenal, which was his first start in more than 4 months. Ahmad made his first ever meaningful Premier League start, and come the FA Cup final, there was an argument that he should play. I personally didn't think he should have started, and he didn't start. The team Ten Hag picked was absolutely perfect. There were a lot of issues to debate going into that one, but he had a 2024 where he got better and better and better, and fortunately for him, he's got a manager now who, you know, puts a lot of stake in what he can do on a football pitch, and we've seen that already with his creativity. His best game under Amorim was probably against Everton, where he didn't score, but he was the architect of that win, and it was United's most convincing win, certainly as far as the scoreline was concerned. It was a strange game, and certainly it wasn't a performance or win I was ever going to get carried away with. There were some headlines that got carried away with it, saying United have lift off under Amorim, and then of course they go and win two of their next 9 games and lose 6 of them. But the takeaway from that day was that they've got a new talisman here, and the talisman in recent years has been Bruno Fernandes, but there's not that heavy onus on him now that there used to be, and that's mainly down to Ahmad. And as you said, he's capable of playing as the wide player. And certainly before last week, I was insisting that he should go back there, because I'm not a fan of having 2 fullbacks as the wingers. It absolutely worked at Liverpool. United have, you know, Trent Alexander-Arnold to thank for that to a huge extent. It will probably be Dalot and Mazraoui again against Arsenal this weekend, which I would completely understand. But long term, they're going to need a bit more. They need more attack-minded options in those 2 wide roles, and that's obviously what Ahmad has given them on the handful of occasions that he's played there. But he is ultimately a forward, and he has got his goals from playing as effectively the playmaker in that team. You know, but there's just so much to admire about him, and I hope, and I'm pretty confident that, having got the contract, his form isn't just going to nosedive, as we've seen with some other United players, because he's been on a really good upward trajectory since he came back from his injury last season. And he's one of the most important players in that team now, and that's reflected by the contract that he's got.
Yeah, he's a brilliant little player. I'll hold my hands up. I had my doubts when I watched him during that loan at Sunderland. He obviously did incredibly well under Tony Mowbray, but there was times when I thought, is he going to cut it at United in the Premier League at the top level? And he's proved that wrong. He's been brilliant. Let's move on to Marcus Rashford then. The official line at Anfield was he wasn't in the squad because he was unwell. He then attended Kath Phipps' funeral on Monday, and when the training pictures were released on Wednesday, he was absent from those. Now, that means he might have trained and he just wasn't photographed, of course, or he didn't train. It was one of those two. We'll get a further clue
think
this
it's the
weekend.
latter.
Yeah, Samuel's smiling when the squad for Arsenal is confirmed, and Amorim might be asked about him today at his press conference. There's been a suggestion of Rashford's representatives being in Italy this week to hold talks with AC Milan and Juventus, and it does seem like there's interest brewing from European clubs. Does your gut tell you, Samuel, that this month there will be a solution to this situation with Rashford?
Yes, there's a market for him, clearly, and United have him to thank for that going public, and I mean that sincerely. He has done United a favour there. It got to the point where he needed a change of scenery. I pretty much put that on him in the summer in writing a piece. I said, like, the club have got to put it on him. Do you want a change of scenery, or do you want to continue? Because the problem he had was that it was still Ten Hag who was the manager, and I'm not for 1 minute saying that United should have just. I mean, they should have changed the manager, but they shouldn't have changed the manager just because of Marcus Rashford. He's had other managers there who he's not always. He's had issues with, or his body language hasn't been quite right, or something's not quite clicking there. And that was always going to be. I always thought that was unsustainable. That was one reason why I thought Ten Hag was destined to fail going into his third season. That his working relationship with Rashford was unsustainable after what had happened last season. And now it's pretty clear that Rashford does want a change of scenery. And unsurprisingly, he's I think it's playing out as he would have wanted it. He was, I think he was quite keen to stress in that interview with Henry Winter that he wants to be, obviously, he wants to play for England, as you'd imagine. And if he wants to play for England, then he actually has to play competitive football, which means you're not going to Saudi Arabia. I thought it was ridiculous that Gareth Southgate he kept on picking Jordan Henderson while he was in Saudi Arabia. And then when he left Saudi Arabia, that's when he actually cut him from the England squad. But it was an open goal for Southgate, point of principle. He'd have got a lot of kudos for just saying, if you're going there, you're not getting in my squad, because you're essentially retiring. You're going to a retirement home, and that's what Ivan Toney has done. And clearly Tony's quite content with that because the money compensates for it. But Rashford wants to be playing in a big league, and this time of year there is always a compromise. It could be a split in wages, with one club paying half and the other club paying the other half, or 60-40 or 70-30. I'm sure United will try and negotiate it more weighted in the favour of the club that would be loaning Rashford in. I know that some Premier League clubs have been linked with him, but I highly doubt that they will be really able to finance it. These clubs are not exactly big payers themselves, and also, that there's the possibility of upsetting the dressing room as well. I think it's a bit different at some of these overseas clubs where he's been touted for, because it is a different dynamic. The perception of, I think we're seeing it a little bit with Trent Alexander-Arnold, that some of these players, they're wondering, well, maybe I'm more valued outside England than I am inside England, which I suppose is an element of truth, but I don't think
I'll
that
actually give
the
credit to Jadon
criticism.
Sancho for that. Do you know, like this influx of British players around Europe in the last couple of years? It was almost Jadon Sancho who was. I mean, there's been British players before him,
Well, he was
obviously,
a
but he
trailblazer
was
for
the
that.
trailblazer. Yeah,
Yeah, and that has obviously become a cliche, but he did take the plunge there when he opted to leave City for Dortmund, and obviously that clearly convinced Erling Haaland and Jude Bellingham that they should also join Dortmund rather than United, and both of them were proven right. And it obviously, there are so many British players abroad now, and you forget that at AC Milan there were two English players there already, in Ruben Loftus-Cheek and Tammy Abraham. So I'm sure that would help as well. It's
Tomori as well.
becoming, yeah, Fikayo Tomori as well. So again, just three Chelsea academy players who have all obviously been sold to rake some cash in. So I can see Milan being a reasonable fit. I mean, let's face it is two fading forces. I know United are a force that faded a long time ago, but Milan have seemed to have been hung over for quite some time. But they have got a new coach in now in Sergio Conceição. Zlatan Ibrahimovic seems to be calling the shots there. And of course, he knows Rashford from having played with him for a season at United. Mostly, I know he was there briefly for the second season, didn't quite go to plan. So there is a relationship there that's established that could work in Rashford's favour. But then, would Milan have the would they have the funds to actually make that permanent in the summer? I mean, I thought all along that Rashford would, if he was to leave this month, it would be a loan rather than a permanent move, and it's still looking that way, unsurprisingly.
I went to the San Siro 2 years ago. It was January actually this time in 2023 to watch. It was a Milan game, not Inter. And bloody hell, it was cold. But the conditions at the San Siro were awful. Old Trafford gets a lot of stick, but San Siro was another world. There was just a hole in the floor for the urinals, which was interesting. Ruben Amorim said at his press conference last week, Samuel, we will try to do something. In the January market. It's obviously difficult to maneuver in the winter window. I think you did a piece on stopgap kind of striker signings. Do you think that's a position United should be looking at addressing in this window? Look, we all know funds are tight at the moment. There's no war chest available to Amram. But if Rashford moves out, that would provide some wriggle room financially and perhaps something could be sorted. Are there any names popping up in your head? We laughed earlier in the week because Nicholas Fulkrook, of course, went to West Ham and we used to champion him on the podcast, but he's not exactly had a good time of things, has he, in London?
Well, he hasn't. But I think the worst thing about that deal was the technical director giving him a 4-year contract, which was obscene. Even if I was the United technical director trying to sign him, I would not have been offering him a 4-year
And how old
contract.
is
It would
he?
have been 2 years.
32? Is he
31.
around
I
that
think he's
age?
31. Yeah. He does
Why
look.
did they
He
give
does
him that
look
length?
older than he is. Yeah, I know. I know. That's what makes it worse. He actually looks older than his age as well. So, not particularly shrewd business by them. Randall Kolo-Muani is someone that United aren't ruling out. It's not a great look. That he scored half the number of goals that Joshua Zirkzee has scored this season. He started twice for PSG, and I know you're not going to get going out there and to try and find someone who's going to definitely get you goals this month is difficult. But I'm not. And also, there's history there. 2 years ago, United there was the first tier of strikers they were looking at, which were Kane and Osimhen. They didn't want to bother Daniel Levy with Harry Kane, which was a mistake. They weren't going to get Osimhen for the price Napoli wanted. Then it was the second tier down. It was potential strikers, Højlund or Muani. And of course, they opted for Højlund. Whether him joining SEG, the agency that represents Erik ten Hag, did that swing it? A cynic may suggest so, but again, the optics of that have not aged well for Højlund, who has got 2 Premier League goals this season. He's actually got fewer Premier League goals than Joshua Zirkzee has, and he was by far and away United's weakest player at Anfield last week. In a game where United played well and almost every individual played well, Højlund did not play well, and that is a big problem for him. Nothing is sticking. He's getting worse. He's not scoring enough. So, of course, they need a striker because goals win football matches, and United have not got a goal scorer in that team. But I'm not necessarily sure Muani would be the answer there because look at his form this season. He didn't really score many goals at PSG last season either. It is interesting that United are going back to him, and PSG actually bid for Højlund in the summer that United signed him, and then ended up signing Muani. So the two clubs were pretty much shopping at the same level for a striker, and neither of them have worked out. So I do question if United were to go for Muani, why they would look at him. It just seems, and also don't push your luck really. They took one player off PSG's hands in the summer, Manuel Ugarte, and certainly in recent months that is starting to work out for United. But you saw when they took 2 players off Bayern Munich, it was excessive. They should absolutely never, ever, ever have signed Matthijs de Ligt. One of the last parting gifts from Erik ten Hag to United, a player who had been in decline for 5 years. And let's face it, that decline has continued at United as well, which happens to a lot of players who sign for United. Nusum Mazraoui, who was a much more more frugal purchase, has been good for United this season, and United have shown some good. There was some good foresight there, and hopefully he continues to be an important player for United and do well for them. But this is, Edward, would you say that January was a market that was driven by the desperation of the seller rather than the I think it's the motivation of the buyer? I can't quite remember what the word he was used, but it was words to that effect. And obviously PSG, they they'd be quite happy for someone to take Moani off their hands because he's a bit part player. But he is not the player that United should be looking for. They need to be a lot more creative than that. And as I've said, I did a piece in it earlier in the week. If Graham Souness or Harry Redknapp or Steve Bruce can find an impact striker in the January transfer window, then United bloody well can. And I know it's a different era, and I know that's going back quite a long time as well. But the principle still applies. There will be a striker out there who is gettable, who can make United better and would score goals in that team and get them up the table. I'm absolutely convinced of that.
Hashtag bring Weghorst back. We'll start that on Twitter. I'm sure he'll bang in the goals for the
Let's
the
not.
season. Let's drop that hashtag. Is Rich Fay, who used to work at the MEN, of course, has he told you about the article he tried to write about Alexander Isak a couple of years ago when he was at Real Sociedad?
Yes. Yeah, you
Yeah,
might as well
and
regale the listeners on that. Go for it.
enough. So Rich wanted to write a piece arguing that United should sign Isaac from Sociedad, of course, and he's doing fantastically well in the Premier League at the moment. Scored against Arsenal earlier in the week in the Cup, and he now looks like one of the world's best strikers. But Liam Corliss, our former editor, told him, no, it's a stupid idea. Well, it probably wasn't as frank as that. Probably a bit kind of his words, but anyways, he rejected it. And now Rich has been laughing this last couple of seasons watching him play and thinking, Liam, why didn't you allow me to write that piece? So, moral of the story, Samuel, don't always listen to your editors. I think that's probably the moral of the story.
Well, Liam is just about to open a brewery now, so I think that tells you that. I think he's kind of like held his hands up and accepted. Yeah, I tried, I succeeded for a brief period, but then in the end,
I'll be there to try.
Not failed. Failed would be far too unkind to him. But yes, he's looking at a career change.
Yeah,
yes,
good for him anyways. I'm sure he'll enjoy it. We'll leave it there for part one. We'll be back in a moment for part two. Welcome back to part two of the Manchester is Red podcast. Now, we do have a game of football at the weekend. As I said in the intro, the third round of the FA Cup away against Arsenal at the Emirates. Now, United played Arsenal just last month in the Premier League, of course. Lost that game 2-0, conceded twice from two set pieces, two corners in the second half of the game. Look, Samuel, United have went away to Anfield at the weekend. They've got a fantastic draw. They could have got more. It was a great performance. We praised them on the podcast earlier in the week. We said they've got to build on that performance. So they've got to continue that away this weekend. And God, they can't concede from a bloody corner, can they?
They can. to quote an impersonate Mick McCarthy there. Yes, they can. I wouldn't especially be confident of their chances of not conceding from a corner. I mean, I thought Newcastle defended the set pieces by and large pretty well in the League Cup tie on Tuesday evening, and Newcastle are better equipped for it because they are a tall team. I mean, Dan Burn, Joe Linton, Bruno Guimaraes. Was it Fabian Schär playing with Burn that night?
Botman was back, but I mean, they were still causing some problems. Arsenal, mind. There was a moment when Dubravka,
they were.
He was at loan at United. Looked unconvincing from a corner. Arsenal are just brilliant at playing those crosses in the box, aren't they?
They are. Fortunately for United, at least, Saka's not available because his deliveries were caused. I think did both goals come from his?
It was Declan Rice and Saka, so they had one each.
One from one side, one from the other side, wasn't it? Yeah. They all rolled into one. I mean, United conceded a corner quite quickly that night, and Partey should have scored from it. But fortunately for United, he's pretty hapless in front of goal. Famous last words. But the tie certainly doesn't look as daunting or as unwinnable as it did a week ago, purely because of how United played at Anfield. And again, they'll have had an even longer gap between games. They'll have had literally a week between matches to prepare for this one. I think Amorim has pretty much got every player that he'd want available. I'm sure some would be making a case for Mason Mount, who did start at the Emirates last month, but didn't actually do anything and is almost always injured. So he could, for the first time, he could play an unchanged side as well. And I think that would signal that would signal some progress there, because there has been a hell of a lot of rotation, and it has been too extreme at times. I mean, Ahmad didn't even start at Arsenal last month, and that was a surprise. United had played 3 days previously, okay, but he in that game against Everton, as I said earlier, he influenced it hugely. He absolutely had to start against Arsenal, and everyone was surprised to see. Well, it leaked out obviously, but that Tyrone Marshall was starting that game. I mean, Luke Shaw was supposed to start, but of course he got injured, so and he's been injured ever since. Ahmad, of course, this weekend he is definitely going to start, and I think the sensible strategy would be to go with an unchanged team. I think there's certainly a case maybe to bring Lenny Yoro in just for his athleticism and his speed. I did worry about United at Anfield, where there was no Yoro. How would they cope against Liverpool's live wire attack? But they defended on the front foot, and they'll have to defend that way again at Arsenal this weekend. So I think it certainly feels like a much more even tie going into it now than it did when probably the draw took place, and certainly in the weeks leading up to this game. And United can go there feeling relatively bullish, and I suppose you look at the result in the week, and that may have gone against United, in that has possibly reinforced Arsenal's focus
Yeah,
ahead.
that was my thinking, Samuel. I think they're going to be more fired up now, aren't they? And they're going to have a point to prove after that. And going out in two cup competitions in 1 week will be really bad for Mikel Arteta.
Well, they're obviously not out of the League Cup, but everything is weighted heavily in Newcastle's favour. It's the second leg at St James's on a
And they've got an awful
Wednesday or a
record
Tuesday
at
night.
St James's
They're
Park.
2-0 down. Newcastle have had their number in the past 2 or 3 years as well up at St James's, and Arteta has not reacted well to losing at Newcastle on 1 or 2 occasions either. So Newcastle, underdogs going into the tie, they're going to be favourites to get to Wembley now. And this weekend's game, it's a straight knockout tie. There's no replay. It could go to extra time, but there will be a winner come hell or high water at the end of it. And I think that will probably reinforce Arsenal's focus. But United do have the benefit of having that big gap between games, and that definitely had. I know Amorim wanted to downplay it, and I can see why he would want to do that, because it shouldn't be an excuse for a team to perform to that level just because they had a relatively big rest in the build up and during their preparation for it. But it certainly had a bearing on their performance, and I think we hoped there would be, just so that it wouldn't be a straightforward thrashing to write up at Anfield last week. And I was always quite confident that United would put up a fight at Anfield. I didn't think that they would get annihilated like some people did, even though a lot of people were wondering how many would Liverpool win by. And you hope for United's sake going into the game this weekend that it's a similar situation where they've had an awful lot of time to prepare. Going off the training footage and imagery that was released on Wednesday, I didn't see Ahmad in the squad. I think I counted 24 players, including the goalkeepers, and you just hope that's a precautionary measure. I mean, obviously he was at Old Trafford for his signing, having images taken there as well. So they made a song and dance about it, but as you would, I don't think that he would have been allowed to go there just and miss training. And you can clearly tell some of those pictures at Old Trafford were taken in the evening. The training session was during the day, but so you hope that he's fit and he's fine for the game on Sunday. I'm sure by the time people have listened to this, there'll be some clarity from Ruben Amorim on that.
Yeah, Amram became quickly synonymous with rotation, didn't he? When he arrived and was changing his team, tweaking his team, and he's done that constantly. But the key thing is, United were playing games every 3 or 4 days, weren't there? And there's now been a week between games, so he can name an unchanged side, and that's what I'd expect too, Samuel. And it makes sense, doesn't it? After that performance at Anfield against Liverpool, and really kind of same caliber of opponents, both away from home, kind of just do it again, lads. Go out there and perform the same.
Yeah, and don't start outside Bayern in a cup game.
Poor outside Bayern, yeah. He only
It's not
plays,
poor
does he?
outside Bayern. He cost them against Tottenham. He's
Yeah, he was terrible, wasn't he?
Thanks for the memories, but it's time to go, as
It's
the
time to go.
immortal Banner said. Yeah.
I mean, one of the bullet points on it. I mean, I wrote these, so I can't really say much. But can United defend the FA Cup? But I know if I ask that question straight out, you're just going to say, "What a crap question." It was a brilliant day,
Yeah,
wasn't it? In
that
May
is a
at
dreadful
Wembley
question.
last year, though, Samuel. It was really special. It was unexpected. They obviously got there by the skin of their teeth against Coventry. Look, we reiterated the point, the importance of trophies. We always do on this podcast because United need to win trophies. But at the moment, it feels like Amram just needs to get this team into the top half of the Premier League. That's not to say there shouldn't be a focus on the FA Cup, because United need to go as deep in these competitions as they possibly can. And you've obviously got the Europa League as well on the side of that.
Yeah, if they go out this weekend, it'll be gutting. It's hardly happened at United that they've been eliminated from the third round of the FA Cup. Certainly in my lifetime, it's happened, I think, on two occasions. Leeds, obviously, being the infamous one and the worst one in 2010, and under Moyes against Swansea in 2014. I don't think it's happened on any other occasion. 2022, it wasn't. That was fourth round against Middlesbrough. Just trying to wrap my brains if in case I've missed one at all, but I don't think I have. So that's how rare it's been. I mean, back in 1984, United were the holders and went to Bournemouth, who I think were in Division Three at the time, managed by Harry Redknapp, and lost in the third round. And that was a huge shock back when the FA Cup meant a hell of a lot more and was much better organised. I mean, I have no idea why Fulham Watford was being played on Thursday night. Everton Peterborough, why that was on the Thursday night. I thought Peterborough put out a really good statement a few weeks ago when those fixtures were confirmed, complaining about the scheduling and how it was going to limit the number of fans who could travel up to Merseyside for that game. FA Cup games should be played on 3 days at the absolute most, but it seems like they're getting played. The carve up is so wide now. It's Thursday to Monday sometimes. I'm not too sure if there are games on a Monday for this round, but there have been in recent years. So I'd never condone United tossing it off in the FA Cup, and certainly don't think they will be this weekend. They've not won it enough times this century. The final last season was only the third occasion they'd won it in the 21st century. I think, was it the first FA Cup final you'd attended? Did you say?
Correct,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, and that I know. Obviously, you're working, and it's not your team who are participating in it or winning in it, but it is a memory to last a lifetime. Whether you're going there as a fan
It's a
or whether you're
privilege, yeah, to
going
go
there,
go and attend that and report on it. Yeah, of course it is.
yeah, or whether you're going there as a journalist. And I do. I've not really reflected on that day at all or anything. I wouldn't need to, but I do. It was a brilliant day. It was. Yeah, I'm very fond of that day. Even just the four of us turning up at my aunt's in Stanmore, her putting on a pot of coffee for us because we were there so early and before getting the train to Wembley, and it is special. And Wembley is not a stadium uh, I've ever particularly warmed to. I've always found it quite, man, it's a bit like a soulless shopping mall in places. It's good for us and in the press box. It's the facilities are good and the views of the pitch are great, and it's pretty good in that sense. But as a fan going there, I've never really liked it. There've been one or two occasions maybe, but it's nowhere near as special as the
It's
old
quite
one
soulless,
was.
isn't it? It's difficult to create an
Yeah,
atmosphere in.
it is, and finals are a little bit different in that tickets can fall into the wrong hands. Some Johnny come latelys can jump on the bandwagon, and that dilutes the impact. I remember the 2016 semi-final when United beat Everton in added time, and the atmosphere was brilliant from the United fans that day. It was their first game at Wembley in nearly 3 years, and that fueled it. And the fact that they hadn't won a trophy in 3 years fueled it as well. And then Marshall scores that goal, and as I said, until last season, that was my highlight in the press box in terms of just the everything that could happen, the drama, the emotion, fans coming in the press box singing Marshall's song, how much it meant United get into the FA Cup final. And the only thing that trumped it was Ahmad's goal, which again it's an FA Cup tie, so that goes to show you that the competition it stirs even hardened cynics like myself, because it is really meaningful. And I think the priority for United this season now is the Europa League, because if they win that, and it is eminently winnable when you look at the other teams in it, then they get into the Champions League next season. They're not going to finish in the top four, the top five of the Premier League. It's too far gone. They need to obviously regain some respectability with their final finish in the Premier League, and it's their bread and butter, as the cliche goes. And that's where most of the fixtures will take place. But the priority has to be the Europa League. That's not to say that they're going to be dismissive of the FA Cup, as we've just discussed. They've had a long time to prepare for this Arsenal game. There is a little bit of expectation now that United will play well because of how well they did at Anfield last week, and they'll have 7,000 fans, or just over 7,000 fans cheering them on. They should have more supporters there. They should have 9,000 supporters, but Arsenal were too gutless to give them the allocation they're entitled to, and the FA were then too gutless to tell Arsenal that to give United more tickets. So that's it's probably not got as much exposure as fans would like, those issues, and it happens quite often. I remember going to a cup tie between Arsenal and Tottenham at the Emirates 11 years ago, I think it was, a third round tie, and Arsenal didn't give Tottenham the full allocation they were entitled to. So again, in terms of how flawed the running and how flawed the organising of the FA Cup is, that's another issue when fans are getting shortchanged by clubs who should be giving them more tickets.
Just before we end the podcast then, Samuel, it's probably worth touching on the funeral of Kath Phipps, who sadly passed away last month, aged 85. She'd obviously been at the club for over 55 years in different roles and was such a hugely popular member of staff. You were there on Monday. Do you want to provide kind of just some words on what it was like to be there? Because by all accounts, it was a very moving day for all involved.
It was impeccably organised by two ex-club employees. When I was just walking towards the cathedral, I think it was just outside Sinclair's Oyster Bar, I saw Phil Townsend, who used to be the director of comms at United, is now director of comms at UEFA. Kate Lowe, who used to work for the club, of course, and left last year, and her husband. So even before I got to the cathedral, I'd seen some familiar faces. And of course, there was a little media pen set up for cameramen, photographers, and a few of us journalists as well to see who was arriving. I'd been given, I'd been made aware of who was going to be there, and obviously everybody's seen from the arrival pictures what that it was the great and good of Manchester United, past and present, who were in attendance. And I'd been told the previous week that the first team were due to attend, and I'm really glad that they performed at Anfield, because it did make it easier going to the cathedral on the Monday. And it was quite a striking sight, two coaches turning up, and then this stream of suited footballers with their ties on, the coat of arms on their jacket, walking very solemnly towards the funeral. I don't know, I can't remember if I've said it before, but the United players should be wearing the club suits far more often than they do. I know eras change, what have you, and that sight was, as I said, it was quite striking and stirring, and that's the way it should be. Sir Alex Ferguson, when he arrived, he was being helped up the cathedral steps by Albert Morgan, the old kit man. He chuckled, "Oh, he's my helper." He was in very good spirits, and I knew that Ferguson was going to read a eulogy, and that was very, very enthusiastic for a man who's 83 and suffered a brain hemorrhage. When was it? Nearly 7 years ago. His recollections are still pretty extraordinary, and of course he had the room wrapped as he always does when he speaks. And he spoke about how she was one girl who ran the club. There was a nice reminiscence about when his wife Ferguson's wife first moved down to Manchester. Kathy, she was in hospital unwell in the Alexandra, and Kath Phipps asked Ferguson if she could visit her. And she did that on her days off. Thursday she had off. So that was, there was a round of applause for Ferguson, as there would be. And then I don't think any of us were aware of this. Johnny Evans strode up to the pulpit, and upstaged is possibly the wrong, would be a little bit too crass to use in the context of a funeral, but his eulogy was word perfect. He's given such sterling service to United, so much so that his name's in the yearbook in 1998. That's how long his association is with the club. But that contribution on Monday was probably his greatest yet. He stood there in his club suit, reading a eulogy that he had researched and written, reaching out to former players for their memories of Kath Phipps, and then very movingly touching upon his own interactions with her, and when she was crying in his arms at some stage last year, where she was unwell and frustrated really at how unwell she was, and she said, "I don't want people to think I'm not good at my job." And you think, this is a woman who would have been 84 or 85 at that time, and she was still working. We saw her at Carrington in September, and Ferguson once said it. He said, "Retirement is for young people," and she's proof of that. For her to keep on going for all those years, from 1968 to 2024, and as I said, even 2 or 3 months before she passed away, to be at Carrington and to still, the building, her reception had moved because of course the work going on there. So she was in the academy building, but she was still there working. Just remarkable woman. 400 guests were there on Monday, and it was a real privilege to be invited to it. And when you're invited to something like that, you've absolutely got to do it justice with the piece afterwards. So as I said, it was, I think occasions like that do bring the best out of United. That was the case certainly when it was the 60th anniversary of the Munich air disaster at Old Trafford, where you had first team, academy, under 21 squads all there, all in their club suits. And I think, fans, you can't underestimate the value of that, and fans really appreciate it as well. It's quite an evocative sight, just seeing Manchester United players turning up in the club suits with that coat of arms on. I know it's smaller than it used to be, but that coat of arms has been sported by the Busby Babes, by George Best, by Bobby Charlton, Dennis Law, all these greats dating back 60 or 70 years. And it really encapsulated the spirit of United on Monday. As sad as sad a situation as it was also the celebration of an extraordinary lady's life. And there were, I think it might have been a family member who read a poem, and Jason Leach, who I think a lot of United fans may recognise. He sits on the reception at East Stand. That he got a mention in the Ruben Amorim unveiling video because he was showing him around Old Trafford. He read a eulogy as well that was very, very thoughtful, very sincere. He actually accompanied Kath to the 99 premiere at the Printworks back in May. So that's how close they were as well. And it was a lean service, but a lovely service.
Incredible person. And we'll leave it there, Samuel. Some lovely words. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Stephen.
And thanks to the listeners, as usual. Have a good weekend. We'll be back on Monday to reflect on the Arsenal game. Take care.